Yes, indeed. What's up, good people? Oh, I'm being left alone on this interview. Oh, that's what's up. All right. Anyway, oh no, Kamal, no, beat it,
Oh
dude.
no,
No,
I
no, no,
definitely
I'm
was coming
good.
on to this. I was coming on to this discussion.
Got to keep
I was
people
about to
out.
say.
Wow.
Can't
Come on,
after those
man.
last opinions, we can't trust you to do a sophisticated interview with
Okay.
anybody. I mean, come on now.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Wow.
So I look, of all of the sort of media Voltron formations that have occurred in this digital moment, the two of yours was one of my. What you two did is one of my favorites at Breakthrough News. The merging of Rania Khalek and Eugene Puryear. I've really appreciated this. I like that collaboration. That's like it was a nice, Avengers super whatever, you know so anyway, if anybody is not familiar with their work at Breakthrough News and previously, please get caught up, add that to your media diet, and we greatly appreciate you coming through here. Good morning to you both and welcome. Good to see you.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Great. Yeah, great to be on. We're so
I feel
happy
the same
to.
way. I love what y'all are doing here.
This is like the ultimate Avengers. It's like the ultimate Avengers now because we all come together, right?
Watch out now. So you all just look, I was even just looking at your page this morning. You talk about international news. You all at Breakthrough are seemingly everywhere, covering everything, particularly that is of meaning to the left. But you did also both. We did ask you specifically this morning to talk about your recent trip because you both went physically to Ethiopia to add even more depth to your already in-depth coverage of what's going on in Ethiopia. We have ventured into those waters and kicked up some dust over here a little bit. So I'm very interested to hear what your perspectives are on what is happening there and what you saw on your trip. Rania, why don't we start with you and you can kick us off with the latest on that.
Yeah, so I mean, as everybody knows, there's been this ongoing war in Ethiopia between the TPLF, which was in power for like 30 years and then was pushed out of power. And so like launched this war last year against the federal government in Ethiopia to try to regain power. And obviously the government's been fighting back and it's been making headlines and it's become a very divisive issue on a number of levels. But I'm really excited we got to go there. And I think, just, to keep it very brief, I mean, one thing that stood out to me from being on the ground in Ethiopia was just how dramatically different what was happening on the ground was from the narrative that we're getting in the mainstream Western press. And it was, I mean, there were so many parallels I felt to the issue of Syria, which is another war that I have spent time covering and been on the ground covering, where basically it was just this group of this insurgent group trying to collapse the state, trying to overthrow the government that had taken over one area after another and unleashed a really unimaginable level of destruction. And that's what we saw. We visited a lot of areas that had been recently, within the last few weeks, taken back by the government from the TPLF that had been under TPLF occupation essentially for the last several months. And what we saw was just, one town after another, very poor, impoverished towns, even before this war, just completely destroyed. The government buildings and public institutions destroyed, hotels destroyed, airports destroyed, health clinics destroyed, people having awful, terrible stories about, their homes being looted, their fathers or brothers, or in some cases, women and children being killed, horrible stories about gang rapes. I mean, it was just terrible what we heard. And, most importantly, I'll just leave you with, I cannot emphasize enough how drastically different what we were seeing on the ground was from this narrative we've been hearing in the U.S. press.
Eugene, before you jump in, I want to talk about that U.S. press thing and ask you to respond, because the U.S. press, basically, which seemed to be a big supporter of Abiy, right? He was getting good media, the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, and then there was this switch, right, with the TPL now being the victims of severe human rights abuses, the overreaching of the government, even like I think yesterday I saw something where the TPLF claimed that they wanted a ceasefire and the evil national government is thwarting any effort to stop the fighting from happening. So as you talk about a little bit on the trip, what caused this shift in U.S. media reaction? As we've seen before many times, you can go back to other people who basically have been cast as villains and then heroes, others who've been cast as heroes and then villains. What caused this media, this not only media shift, but this U.S. State Department shift in its treatment of Ethiopia, in particular, Abby, at this time?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think for a lot of us, we were kind of caught off guard. I can remember when Prime Minister Abiy came to DC. I think that was 2019. It was like the whole world loved him. You know, Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, was like joined it at the hip with him, moving around the city and all these different pieces. And I'm glad you linked the State Department and the media piece, because I think the media switched when the government switched. And from my point of view, it's really two specific things, both related to the regional politics of the area. I mean, you know, really the first big shift was when Trump said on a phone call with the so-called head of the Sudanese government, this now coup monger, that Egypt should bomb the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and that they had no choice but to do that. And I think a lot of people were shocked at that, because two supposed U.S. allies, you know, at odds over an issue. What is this about? But I think when you really start to put that together with the 2018 peace deal with Eritrea, it all really starts to make sense in the context of it all. I mean, you know, there's a lot that could be said about the dam. I think most of Egypt's claims about the dam and what it's going to do with the water are mainly spurious. But I mean, just the idea that one of the key pillars of the U.S. Israel imperial strategy for keeping their hegemony in the Middle East, at a time, we have to remember, they're trying to move more troops to Asia, right, to go against China. The fact that one of their key pillars that, you know, obviously could destabilize the whole thing if they wanted to, is saying Ethiopia is doing this unforgivable thing and must be stopped at all costs, I think absolutely influenced the U.S. to say, well, if we got to, you know, lose somebody, better to lose Ethiopia than Egypt, especially when you combine that with what we've seen with Eritrea, the peace deal in 2018, the move towards more of a you know, as it's called there, the New Horn of Africa concept, working with Farmajo in Somalia. There's a lot of things that we can say about all these different governments, but I think the one thing we can say is for the U.S., it looks too similar to what they've seen in, let's just use another country from the region, Iran, where you have a group of countries coming together, movements coming together with many differences, with a very different regional understanding of what the architecture and the hierarchies and the politics should be than what the so-called rules-based international order from the United States is, and then that's very dangerous. And so Ethiopia, Eritrea, Farmajo in Somalia all became targeted in this context in the same way I think Iran is targeted, the pink tide in Latin America is targeted, you know, that China is targeted, because it's all a part of this desire to prevent any sort of different emerging, either regional or international power structures that can challenge U.S. hegemony. And I think that the media just followed right in train with that. And as soon as the TPLF, which spent 30 years as the handmaiden of U.S. imperialism all over Africa and also inside of the United Nations with some of the things they've done over the years, offered the opportunity to shift those politics and to break up what I think the U.S. views as a very dangerous regional situation. They jumped on it, the media jumped on it, and we can't really get beyond the idea that TPLF stole 30 or 40 billion dollars when they were in power. And we look at this network of journalists and think tanks and others who are out here promoting this. It makes you wonder, you know, what has happened with some of that money and how some of these networks got created.
Rania, what would you say was some of the similarities between your coverage in Syria and Ethiopia?
Well, I mean, there's two really big things that stand out to me. One is, like I mentioned, the sort of stark difference between the media coverage, you know, where the narrative in the US has been very much there's this glorious, you know, group of rebels who are just like fighting for freedom and against genocide, and we should be supporting them. And they're fighting an evil, horrible government. And then you go on the ground and it's like, wait, no, like these rebels are actually committing atrocities and trying to collapse the state. Like, regardless of what you think of the state, they're trying to collapse it, which is, you know, in a country like Syria that was like 30 million people, you saw how horrific that was. Imagine how horrible it would be for the country of Ethiopia, a country of 110 million people, to collapse. It would destabilize the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and Europe like tenfold. So that was very similar to me. I mean, the other thing was just the level of destruction and kind of like hatred. With the case of Syria, you had this sort of collection of Salafi jihadist groups that obviously had a very hateful ideology that were, you know, killing minorities and trying to institute like religious theocracy in whatever areas they took over. And so, you know, the people in the country were generally very much against this group, these different Salafi jihadist groups. And that was something similar that I saw in Ethiopia, where you had this very destructive insurgency come through and commit all these atrocities. And we spoke to a lot of the victims, and almost every one of them would say, when their house was being looted, when they were being raped, when their father was being dragged out and killed, or their brother was being dragged out and killed, they were, the TPLF fighters were leveling these horrible, like bigoted, sort of ethnic supremacist words at them and saying, we're doing this because you're, from Amhara, or we're doing this because you're donkeys, or we're doing this because, Tigray is better or something. So there's that similarity as well. And just also, like, I think there's something very symbolic when an insurgency group that is trying to collapse a state goes into an area or a town or a village and takes over. It's very telling what they destroy. And in the case of Ethiopia and Syria, they destroy anything affiliated with a public institution, anything that sort of represents the government, even if it's the municipal government. And so that's what we saw, a lot of destruction of government buildings, like whatever is the equivalent of the DMV, a government service building, a lot of public schools, destruction of a lot of health facilities. So this was very much, these were just like, I just felt like being in Ethiopia. I'm like, man, it's the same thing everywhere, whether we don't know exactly the extent of how much the US has been supporting the TPLF beyond rhetoric, but rhetorically they have been supporting them, even if they say they haven't. And it just seems like, whatever country you go into, whatever country upsets the American imperial order, where the US hits back through proxies, it's just that same horrible level of destruction and really shattering of society in such irreparable ways that, when this is all over, Ethiopia is going to have a lot of rebuilding to do, not just physically, but also like societally.
Eugene, my bad. Go ahead, Kalaji, if you have
No. Go ahead.
follow.
No.
I was just going to ask, actually, both of you, but well, first, why is it important that people go, our media and journalists go physically to these places? I was thinking, Kalanji was saying a few minutes ago, we're in this moment of everything's so much easier for people to do behind these screens nowadays. Why couldn't you just talk to a good journalist or activist from Ethiopia and interview? Why is it important that media outfits like yours and others, literally go to these places and engage more directly? Why? What could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that there's so much to it. Obviously, we were there for what, I think 6 days, Rania. So you're only going to be able to see so much. But what you're able to see does really matter. I think even what Rania was saying in the context of the difference between just the mainstream media and what's actually happening on the ground. We of course knew that before we went, but it was honestly like, I hate to say shocking, but it was shocking. You're just like, wow, this is like totally just cognitive dissonance in terms of what we're hearing. I think also just the opportunity to be able to go and speak to the people who are the most directly affected by what's happening by the TPLF, for anybody who has an opportunity to go, is extraordinarily notable. We were also in Eritrea, which is another country which is deeply demonized, which no one knows almost anything about in the United States. So the ability to just go and even get a feeling, to get a sense, to be able to see some of what's going on, to hear the other side of the story, and people can take it or leave it, of course, what we're reporting and what we're saying, but to have that opportunity, I think one-on-one to yourself is key. Now, of course, we have had, activists and journalists and others, Ethiopians, from a range of different perspectives on BT. So I think that's definitely important, and really actually critical to really getting a sense of what's going on the ground. But it just felt like, we had the opportunity to go, we had the opportunity to take a look, to get what we could get, to get the stories we were able to do, and to bring them, more or less unmediated, or at least maybe only through our own filter, to our audiences. And I think it just adds to that body of work and that body of information, to really help people get a good sense of, who's really hurt. A piece I think we're going to put out today, hopefully, we were able to go to one of these industrial parks that's employing tens of thousands of workers that, ultimately, long story short, because the US is removing Ethiopia from these free trade deals, like millions of these workers could lose their jobs, certainly tens or hundreds of thousands. And so, to hear their voices directly, like they're saying they're doing this for humanitarian reasons. But when we're talking to a single mother who's like, this job is everything and is my lifeline, I think it puts a very different cast on those sorts of policies. So to be able to like get and interact and see and hear those stories from people, and bring them back, I think was critically important for us.
Yeah, and I would add one thing to that. Everything Eugene said, plus, our audience is American and our government is deeply involved in what's happening with this conflict, not just with the war itself, but like Eugene mentioned, with this kind of economic warfare on this country of 110 million people. And it's affecting regular people. It's affecting moms and dads and their kids. And Americans need to know that. And so I hope that, like, by going there and actually being able to speak to people, like we do have plenty of packages and reports that we're putting together, we can hopefully bring people in the US an understanding from those who actually live there of what the consequences are of these policies, because the only way to stop them is for Americans to tell their government to stop.
Coming from the U.S. With its treachery, and the people knowing the involvement of the West, did you all encounter any distrust, or was there any roadblocks, in regards to speaking with the people? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe the greatest distrust I think we encountered was in the airport trying to go to Eritrea. It felt like the guy was like deliberately slow walking us, that we would miss our plane because we had all this camera equipment. I don't know. I don't want to disparage the weather,
Mm.
but it kind of felt that way. And that was kind of what I took as like, oh, he probably saw us as like American passports, all this
Yeah.
camera equipment. These are just the same people everywhere. I would say, yeah, like moving around Amhara state, especially where, the war is like just happening. I would say people are suspicious of everything and everybody to some degree. But of course, like, we stood out in a like a sore thumb, as they openly say. So, I mean, ultimately, people were like opening up once they got a sense of who we were and what we were doing. A lot of people over there do know us and have followed Breakthrough News. So, like, that also opened a lot of doors when people were like, oh, it's those people, da 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 da. But I would say ultimately, if of the affected people, people really were looking to tell their story. I think that a lot of people feel that if atrocities were done to them by the TPLF, no one really cares, no one's really interested. The media isn't. There was a handful of international media, but it's not like a lot of these kind of situations where everyone's kind of flooding there for like the atrocity porn. It's kind of the opposite of that. And I think a lot of people were just like happy to be able to tell their story because it feels like it's been so wiped out in the international narrative, and people can see that. I mean, not only from what they see themselves in terms of social media, blah blah blah, but also in terms of friends and family who live in the diaspora in the US and Europe, like how much these stories aren't being told. So I think the hunger to just get the story out was greater than anything else. And I think we encountered that a lot, that people were just like, yes, I want to like get this on record, that this is what I'm saying happened to me and happened in my town, that everyone should pay attention to.
I'm interested in the geopolitical angle too. I mean, we're not necessarily in a multipolar or where there's equal superpower engagement going on, but we have reached this level now where, like you were mentioning before, China's role in the area. Obviously, China is, and people are constantly now discussing China, whether or not it's the new imperialist, whether or not it's just giving resources, and whether or not it's something, obviously somewhere in between that. But China's role seems to be omni-important in terms of the U.S.'s reaction to the newer government of Ethiopia. The fact that it seems like Abiy was trying to balance sides or taking more resource. Can you talk a little bit about the geopolitical aspects of what's happening in terms of the Horn of Africa, in particular with some of these battles that are happening?
I think Eugene can probably like lay that out better than I can, but I will just say before he does, I know he can. I will say something that I thought was really interesting that I observed in Ethiopia specifically, but also to an extent in Eritrea, is as the Ethiopian public is very much angry at the US because they feel the US is supporting the TPLF to destroy their country after the TPLF ruled them with an iron fist for 30 years. That's the narrative there. What you do see from China, while the US is like seen as this destructive force that's trying to collapse the country, we did see a lot of infrastructure projects from China, like really, especially in the capital, just huge, beautiful parks, a huge public library, things that are really useful for like your average person. So just, from that very basic level for the few days where we were there, that was so noticeable. It's like, you see things with China written on them that are really nice and being built, and infrastructure that's useful for people. And then with the US, it's just punishment and sanctions and removing them from trade deals and supporting this insurgency. And then in Eritrea, one thing I thought was interesting is, Eritrea was a little late to join the Belt and Road Initiative, because they kind of take their time and they're not like on anyone's side. They're doing what's best for them as a country. So they take their time and evaluate. And I really think I got the feeling from speaking to people there that had it not been for the way the US treats Eritrea, they might not have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I mean by that is US bullying behavior towards these countries in many cases is what's pushing them into the China orbit. And I'm not saying that to give America like advice on how to do imperialism better, but it is just a little bit funny. Like the US is shooting itself in the foot constantly because it just punishes and bullies and China builds. But please, Eugene, go ahead, because I know you can.
Well, I was going to say also before you do, Eugene, I think that actually would be a good segment, Rania, for you to develop doing imperialism better with Rania, like a little mini, like how to, like tips for improving your. Anyway, sorry, Eugene, go ahead.
No. I mean, that I might be interested in watching that. It certainly have some comedic value, but yeah, I mean, no, I think that's right. I mean, I have a comrade in Zambia who always says about this issue in Zambia. Zambia doesn't have a China problem, it has a capitalism problem. I mean, I think China has a very clear set of objectives for its country and for what it wants to do around the world. I don't think it's very duplicitous about it. And I think sort of what people get from China, not just in Africa, but around the world in terms of trade, the type of projects or whatever it may be is really dependent on the leadership of those countries. And like, for instance, if you look at many of the countries that people will say, oh, well, they're in all this debt to China, they're also in way more debt to the West because they aren't actually interested in national development. They're interested in collecting a bunch of debt to pursue certain projects that certainly benefit them and which they're skimming off the top of quite a bit. And so, yeah, China, like everywhere in Africa, if I've been to Ghana, I've been to South Africa, anyone who's been to Africa knows China is very present. You see China all over the place. Turkey is also very present. The US, France. I mean, many of these international forces are present. But yeah, the impact of China is big. I think in terms of what the outcome of what China's interaction is going to be is also the outcome of what the class struggles on the African continent, the anti-imperialist struggles on the African continent, what those are going to be and the types of governments, the types of movements in terms of how they're able to interact and how they're able to grow. But I think there's no doubt about it. When you look at the context of what's happening, obviously the way China has emerged in the African continent is it is willing to offer a set of deals and approaches and ways of interacting that are in fact favorable to many people vis-a-vis the United States, which is obviously less interested in any sort of empowerment or national development, while I think China's goals are not necessarily contradicted by countries that want to have national development, want to lift their people up, and so on and so forth.
Hey, I know we don't have all the time in the world, but Ear Doctor said he had to take a call. So I am very. Do we have time to ask their opinion on the Ottawa Menelik question?
Yes. I have time. Do you have time?
I mean,
because show schedule. I appreciate Black Power Media. I don't want to mess up the show. But
let's go. Let's get it, Eugene.
I'm gonna get my popcorn.
So do either of you want to? What? Somebody lay out for what happened with our interview the other day and what some of the response has been, and then let's ask Eugene and Rania for their thoughts on this. Kamal, Kalonji, either of you want to run that down real quick?
Let Kamal get down.
I can try.
Well, you try. I got a little disturbance in the back. You start now.
Well, the short of it was we had a guest on the other day who was arguing that there is some within the Pan-African nationalist left diaspora, some misunderstanding of the Battle of Adwa and the role of Menelik, and that the argument from his perspective is that we get caught up in the symbolism of a victory over an imperial power, not realizing that it was done in large part as a proxy for another imperial power that was backing Menelik, right? So then there was some response that we've gotten from the diaspora. So already that has said, nah, dude was wrong. The battle is essential. The victory is essential. So for me, I'm interested both in the specifics of this piece of history, but also broadly speaking, how we, as today's radical left, et cetera, and so forth, use moments of history symbolically whether we do it right or well enough or not. Anyway, so I'm just correct anything that I didn't lay out properly, and then I'm interested in anybody, or go ahead or just respond.
Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, part of the question is like there's so many questions that are all kind of nested in that. I mean, and I'm happy to talk about Menelik and you know the Battle of Adwa in 1896, which I think is notable and important. And I think there is something to be said about sort of the contested narratives around a lot of this. But in a way, to me, it feels like the bigger issue is what does that say about where we are right now and the context of where we are right now? Because I think the sort of subsidiary argument that's being brought in train with, you know, some of this call for historical reconsideration, as it were, is the idea that essentially what is happening right now in the context of Abiy Ahmed and in the context of the No More movement is that it's basically the same thing. That people are getting caught up in, you know, an anti-imperialist, or at least I think maybe they would argue sort of seemingly anti-imperialist front that's, you know, opposed to this regime change effort that's being pushed to the West, and they're missing all of the side aspects that show that in reality Abiy Ahmed is a long continuation of a long history inside of Ethiopia of the oppression of various nationalities. There's about 83 nationalities in Ethiopia, and that, you know, we need to reconsider that history to reconsider our current reality. And I think that, you know, it's a logical argument, but I don't think it's fair or true in many ways, quite frankly, about our current moment, at least. And I'll come around to the historical point. I mean, you know, look, I don't want to go into some whole huge long thing. I think that this is not the forum for it, and nor am I like the world's #1 expert on, you know, the issue of nationality in Ethiopia. But I think that it's much more complicated than it's being presented in the context of what's happening right now and the reconsiderations in the country itself. I mean, just for instance, if we look at what happened in the last election that took place in June, of which there's in and of itself quite a bit of contestation. I mean, you look at the Somali region where, you know, a very large number of people, over 1 million people, voted in favor of the Prosperity Party, as even the opposition, the sort of people who hate Abiy Ahmed, said, because their leaders are considered widely respected in local communities. They've been sidelined historically through the TPLF, and they view this as an opportunity to have their voice heard in a way that's never been heard before. The Sidama state becoming its own state, something the TPLF tried to prevent for 30 years. I mean, even in the Oromia region, where obviously at this stage in the game, there is, I mean, Abiy Ahmed himself is an Oromo. Obviously, in this moment, I think there's a lot of consideration about what Oromo nationality even means. And if we consider, let's say 10 to 12 million people in Oromia voted for Abiy Ahmed, he is an Oromo, they're Oromos. Even if you just say that's a plurality of the population, obviously that represents, in the context of, you know, the fracturing of groups like the OLF and other people like that, you know, people are reconsidering what like Ethiopianness means, what nationality means, and looking at it in a way that I don't think can just be sort of wiped away. And when we get to the issue of, you know, Amhara chauvinism, Abyssinian supremacy, and other things that are put out there, well, I mean, I raised the election period again to say that I guess Abiy Ahmed is such a Amhara chauvinist that's why hundreds of thousands of Amhara people were demonstrating against him in the height of the election campaign and blaming him for violence against the Amhara. And as we've also seen with the issue of Fano, the Amhara militia, and you could certainly see this if you look at the No More hashtag, there was a big undercurrent of whether or not they weren't giving them guns because they didn't appreciate them enough. So I say all that just to say that I think it's not fair in any way, shape, or form to say that either what's happening in Ethiopia on the ground with Abiy Ahmed, who obviously is promoting a policy, it's in his book, of sort of multinational, multi-ethnic reality of Ethiopianness that there are many people who obviously don't agree with, and that there are obviously millions of people who do agree with and who do feel that their diversity and their ethnicity is empowered by this movement, while others feel that they're being sidelined, and it's some of the same thing. But that's a dynamic interaction that's also overlaid with the historic conversation between Ethiopians and Eritreans, which in and of itself is a challenging issue. I mean, you look at my Twitter this morning, and I posted something about a book that I was able to go to the book launch of Eritrea, and I'm coming to 1896 because this is one of the questions that's raised in the book about the relationship of Menelik to the Eritrean struggle, and also the Eritrean struggle to the Italian move on Haile Selassie. And, you know, many of my followers, some of whom I think are good people, were like in my mentions, like, how could you spread this? This is so terrible. This is so whatever. And so I think to just say, you know, and I think looking at the No More movement, it's a repository for all of this. And quite frankly, you're seeing many different things, including the attempted emergence of Tigrayans who are against the TPLF, who are looking for their own voice in the context of this. And I think a lot of people see that, it's not chemically pure. I mean, I've had to speak out against people wanting to vote for Republicans. And I say to all my friends and no more who are listening to me, again, I will remind you that's not a good strategy. But the reality is that huge masses of people across all sorts of different nationalities have united against the TPLF, are pushing against the TPLF, have tried to develop this no more movement in a moment which, with the fall of the TPLF, has opened up in a huge way so many of these questions of historical memory and so many questions of what it really means to have multinational, multi-ethnic unity, to have unity and diversity, and so on and so forth. And I think we shouldn't short circuit that conversation by just saying, well, because we don't like Abiy Ahmed, then any movement of people, a lot of whom support him, is just misguided and not doing anything and is promoting the old history. So anyway, to go all the way back, this is the final thing I'll say. If you look at the context of Menelik in 1896, I don't actually even think it's that rare, right? Like, I think that doesn't make it good, but really a lot of the questions that are there is that Menelik's sort of deal with the Italians immediately after the Battle of Adwa was what allowed him to gain the breathing space to expand his empire, sort of a feudalistic type situation, into many parts of the southern, especially southern parts of what we now know as Ethiopia, including some very significant, very destructive campaign that took place in the Oromia region, including the context of slavery and selling people into the Arab slave trade. But in the context of the U.S. rush for Africa, I guess I would argue maybe we need to have a broader discussion, because the same thing can be said of Tipu Tip. The same thing can be said of the Mahdist movement in Sudan. I mean, and also others in Western Sudan, now areas that are Mali, where the people offering the toughest resistance to Western imperialism carving up the continent were also deeply implicated in the slave trade and the slave trade into the Arab world. And there's a lot that can be said about that, but I also think that we have to be able to look at, why is it that a number of Eritrean rebels fought on Menelik's side in that battle? Now, of course, there's also the history we know of the Eritreans who fought on the other side who were brutally maimed by him, but we also know that there were Eritreans who opposed the Italian moves against Haile Selassie, who were fighting for Eritrean independence and nationalism and against, their own subjection. But in the context of a complicated world and a complex set of things, we're engaging in what's a kind of chemically impure world. So I guess I just say that to say that. Final thing. I'm sorry.
This is the final thing?
I think for the US, I'm doing my Louis Farrakhan.
It's Eugene final. Yes.
For people in the US, the main issue, obviously, is opposing US imperialism, trying to do a regime change effort on Ethiopia and by extension Eritrea, and to try to keep the area into a colony. But I do think that there's a lot of narrowing of the conversation to just do the opposite of saying, well, you don't want to just support Abiy Ahmed, and then it's like, oh, we're just going to support, the narrative of his opponents, and not look at the dynamic interplays that are happening right now in that context. So
I just wanted to two quick summary points before you all jump in.
I also have a summary point.
No, but the issue, I just want to make sure everybody's clear.
Yeah.
The issues in East Africa and Ethiopia are simple. And the Republican Party is the party of the African diaspora, right? I just want to make sure I got it. Kamal, Kalanji, go ahead. I got it. I'm good. Thank you.
Really quickly, I just wanted to add, because some of this again comes down to the idea like socialism versus Pan-Africanism/nationalism, because some of the same space that is given for, historically speaking, Vietnam, the Vietnamese Revolution at one point was funded by aspects of American imperialism to fight against the Japanese, right? So it feels also like there's these contradictions of what people do in real world scenarios to keep what they consider to be their landmass intact or their country intact, and not to leave it to the other imperial forces around it. But I think also this comes to I think in Ethiopia, right, there's these larger conversations around what you're alluding to. So talk about this, like what national unity means, and or whether or not Ethiopia can hold in terms of a center and be considered a nation state, and who benefits if all of the ethnic groups simply break off from each other under the guise of self-determination and fighting oppression from a larger national state, and become smaller national states or states in that region. And whether or not there's again, from some people's point of view, that's an outcome that some folks want. And then there's the larger issue of, historically speaking, even with the differences in terms of the ethnic groups and the amount of different ethnicities, that there has been a national unity where over most of its history. Folks have married, inter-ethnic group, spoken different languages. It hasn't been the thing that's broken Ethiopia apart. And it wasn't until the TPLF was in leadership after it overthrew, I believe, the socialist government, that it began to install the idea of these ethnic regions, and some say as a way of controlling, as opposed to a way of providing some sense of real independence, which is now coming back to this interplay of like potentially, and I'm not sure about this, but potentially what could be considered the breaking up over the long term of an Ethiopian national unity.
And it's divide and conquer, right? Like it's something I'm very familiar with in the Middle East, where it's all by sect. I'm in Lebanon right now, where it's, this was imposed on Lebanon, the system of sect-based politics was imposed on Lebanon like back in the 20s. So and I think that that's one narrative that we heard quite often is people were very, very upset. They said the TPLF introduced this problem. We didn't have this problem, not this way, until they introduced this situation in the 90s, like you just laid out, of this like ethnic based states. And then gave every state the right to secede, which now, the TPLF kind of wants to do with Tigray. And that's a real problem. And I have to say, obviously, like it's not as, Abiy Ahmed is a complicated person, but as a leader, there's no denying that after the TPLF ruled the country in this very authoritarian way where there was no political space and people ended up in prison and disappeared, when Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party came to power, it inspired a lot of people who are in the Prosperity government party to also join the government. People who were comfortably teaching at universities in the States picked up and changed their lives and went and joined the government because they felt inspired that there was more space and more room to be involved in a country that they formerly weren't able to be involved with. And we spoke to people like that. I mean, that was one thing that was really interesting. There was people who were never involved in politics, never considered that their lives would turn into like something that was involved in government. And because of Abiy Ahmed's rise to power and the political space he created in this kind of new Ethiopia, they felt inspired to be a part of it. And so I think there's something to be said about that. And, just one last thing I'll say is I understand people want to have conversations and debate, what's good for Ethiopia, what's good for Eritrea, what's good for the Horn of Africa. But like, you don't live there. There's people who do live there. And as Americans, I feel like first and foremost, like we should be wanting our government to stay out so people who are there can figure it out because they're the ones who ultimately have to deal with the consequences of whatever their region looks like.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, there's the old slogan that countries want independence, nations want liberation, and the people want revolution, right? Like imperialism is constructed on so many different levels. You could be bad, for workers and still be targeted by imperialism. You could be
Right.
fighting for national liberation for your own nation and be in conjunction with imperialist aims, as we see in some parts of the Middle East right now. So there's so many different complicated layered questions. And I do think that, really the biggest issue for people here is, are we going to build a united front that can push back against the aims of US imperialism? And in that context, we're not going to agree on all these questions. I don't think we need to agree on all these questions to build an effective united front against US imperialism. But I do think we have to be open to the fact that, this is a dynamic conversation, as Rania said, that is happening in real time in the Horn, in the diaspora, around a lot of very serious, very heavy issues. And we had to create space for that as well, in the context of what's going on. And I think that, maybe I'll just leave it there before I go.
And that's why we can't have Black Panther on Ear Doctor's list of revolutionary movies, because Wakanda, in fighting for its national independence, was giving everything over to the imperialists. That is exactly what I'm saying. Thank you, Eugene.
It took Eugene to figure that out. Thank you, Eugene. Hey, Eugene.
Well, that's what Eugene meant.
That's his job. Hey, you mentioned a broader discussion, and I'm proposing right now that in January we have a roundtable around the question of Ethiopia and its history, and what's going on right now. Because we had several guests on in the past, and the last couple haven't really agreed with each other. They've been on different screens, so we want to bring everybody to the table and just say, let's hash it out and figure out, the real.
Spouse is upset. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah,
It's
yeah. All kinds of things going
I'm
down.
down.
Yeah.
I'm down. I think that's
Yeah.
a very good point. I think that's a very
Yes.
good point.
And then
Cool.
we also at some point have to have Rania come back and talk about all the great things that are happening in Lebanon, who have clearly
Woo.
overcome all of that imposition and are living free and
Hey,
clear of all
I'm
of
just
that as
happy
well.
my electricity's been on this entire program.
Wow. Okay.
Killmonger was right. I'm telling you, Team
I'm
Killmonger.
on the same team. I taken a lot of hate for that, but I'm with that.
When my daughters came home from seeing that movie and said, "Daddy, we know your Team Killmonger," I was like, that was one of my most proud parenting moments ever. They could identify that Killmonger was right, and that I was like, I'm done. Now I'm done. Anyway, Rania, Eugene, thank you both very much. Again, I can't praise Breakthrough News enough. I appreciate all that you all do, and I love the collaboration. Appreciate you all coming on. We look forward to more, and keep up the good work. And thank you very much. We definitely say
Thank
peace
you.
to you, as Fred said, because we know you fight for it. So thank you.
I don't.
Thank you guys.
Appreciate
It was a
y'all.
pleasure.
Appreciate y'all.
Everybody
Stay
donate to Black Power Media.
Yes.
We like
Yes,
that too.
you heard Eugene. Listen,
Hey.
you heard him. I mean,
With good
yeah.
credit
Woke
cards.
Kamau up.
With
Kamau
good
just-
credit cards.
All right,
Kamau
y'all.
disagree with everything you said up to that point. But